What's up, guys? Welcome back to another daily Bible reading snapshot. Today we're reading the end of what Elihu has to say about God and about Job and all of that. So we're looking at Job 35, 36, and 37. So Elihu right here, what he starts to talk about with Job is you have not earned the right to get stuff from God. Which that's kind of the summary statement here that I'm going to give for it. But here's the point. He talks about these little things that Job has done where he's basically assumed that because he's lived a righteous life, that God owes him certain things. And what he goes on through here to say is, look, God is above the heavens. He's above all that. If you do what's evil, guess what? God's technically not affected by it. If you do what's good, guess what? God's not affected by it. So why do you think you've earned the right to demand what you want from God? You have not earned that right. And some people do this today where they think if I obey God and I do what's right, then God has to do good to me. Then God is forced. We're going to force God to do something that I want him to do by being obedient or whatever. Okay, that's foolish. It's nonsense. And Elihu says, look, you can't force God to do anything. Don't think that he needs whatever you think you can give to him. So he says, you speak like a foolish person. So he says in the end here, says that Job speaks like this and pridefully because he doesn't think about God's judgment. And further, because God doesn't answer Job right away, Job walks down a path of foolish talk about God, which is very true. He spoke too much, where if he had that conversation with God face to face, he never would have complained. He would have been like the Job that we saw in Job chapter 3, who said, God has given, God has taken away, and he is blessed. Blessed be the name of the Lord. So after that, in Job 36, Elihu starts to talk about God here, and he says something interesting. Verse 3, he says, I will get my knowledge from afar, and ascribe righteousness to my Maker. For truly my words are not false. The one who is perfect in knowledge is with you. He's not talking about himself. I think he's talking about God there. He's basically saying, you and your friends have not had all the wise words to say. I want to get my wisdom from God. So let's look at God for a little bit. And that's what he's going to do in these next chapters. He's going to talk about how great God is. And one of the big things that he shows is God does things that we don't understand. And that doesn't just mean God's confusing. That's not the point. The point is God has done so many things that are incredible and amazing. And when we look at them, we can be impressed by them. But the reality is we don't even understand them completely. Let alone, it's not right for us to critique God or to say that God should have done things differently, because his understanding is amazing. So it says here in verse 23, who has prescribed for him his way? Or who can say, you have done wrong? Elihu says, none of us can tell God that he's wrong. So basically what Job was doing was he was telling God, you were wrong to do this. So Elihu says, don't say that, because none of us can tell God that he's wrong. He talks about how God's eternal, how God's beyond all comprehension. He talks about how God's majesty is shown in nature. Really, that's what chapter 37 talks a lot about. It talks about the amazing things that we see God doing. Verse 5 of chapter 37. God thunders wondrously with his voice. He does great things that we cannot comprehend. If we look at the downpour and the rain and the cold and the ice and all the stuff that we see in this planet, all the weather systems, we can't even understand it completely, let alone we can't say for sure what's going on in every situation. We cannot even guess the weather perfectly. So Job is being corrected here by Elihu's right ideas about God, that God is more amazing than we can think of. And the last verse, super important, I think, for us to catch what Elihu says. He says in verse 24, therefore men fear him, fearing God. He does not regard any who are wise in their own conceit. Now, he doesn't just say this as a general principle without context. I think what Elihu's saying is, Job, you have been unwise because you've been speaking out of your own conceit. And why is God going to say, oh, Job, you're right about all those things you said about me? Because he's been speaking out of his wise conceit. He thinks he's wise, but he's not really. So the point is, Elihu's correcting these thoughts that Job said. And I think most of what Elihu says here is right and it's true. And we really should take Elihu's warnings to Job to our own hearts to say that God knows better than us. And it'd be best for us to accept gladly whatever the plan of God is instead of questioning God. It's so unwise for us to say to God, why did you do this? Why did you do this? Because he's got some reason for why he did it, and it's more impressive and more amazing than maybe we think. And I want you to think about something today as we look at all this. Think about all the things that we don't understand that God does. Now, I know that's kind of a hard assignment, but really think about it. There are so many things in the world and in our hearts and in our minds that we cannot even perfectly understand. And if we can't understand those, and God does, God must be working out a plan in this world that is above our comprehension. And maybe one day we'll understand it better. And certainly for Job, he understood his situation better after he died and went to heaven and understood from God what happened here. But before that, it doesn't say that Job ever really got the answers to that. So Elihu is a helpful instrument of God here, I think, to correct Job and to give us a good perspective here about God. So, all right, that's our Old Testament reading. Today we're in Acts chapter 14. We're looking at the whole chapter. First of all, they're in Iconium, then they're in Lystra. And again, what happens? Some people believe, others don't. And one of the things that happens in Lystra is some of the people think that Paul and Barnabas are Greek gods. So it says they call Barnabas Zeus, and Paul they call Hermes, because Paul was the chief speaker. So we can imagine here, one of the things that's important to remember, Barnabas was probably a lot older than Paul, and you can imagine an older guy might look like Zeus, younger guy, the one who's talking a lot, that's Hermes maybe. If you know anything about the Greek gods, that was what they were called. Now, what is the response of Paul and Barnabas to being called this? And why were they called it? Well, they're called it because Paul does a miracle that God works through him, heals a crippled man, and because of that, everybody tries to worship them. But Paul and Barnabas do not accept the praise of men. They do not do what Herod did and say, yeah, that's right, that's me. They say no, they tear their clothes. They say, men, don't do this. We are men just like you. We actually are here to get you to turn away from this superstition. You're false gods. We came to turn you away from this and turn you to the living God. And it says they were barely able to keep them, barely able to restrain them from sacrificing to them. So bad things are going on here in Lystra. And they get worse because the Jews come into town and they get all the people to decide we're going to stone them. Instead of worshiping them, we're going to turn against them and hate them. And instead of worshiping God like they should have, they stop worshiping them and start persecuting them. And when that happens, Paul is actually stoned almost to death. They thought he was dead, but he came back into the city. They went to Derbe, another city, and then they went to Iconium and Antioch, and what they did there is Paul and Barnabas strengthened the Christians. And here's what he said to them, saying that through many tribulations we must enter the kingdom of God. So that's an important thing for us to understand, that we will enter the kingdom of God, but we'll enter into it only through a lot of tribulations. Now, you might not be hit with rocks like Paul was, but just know that if you are an ambassador for Christ, you will be hit with some things that are unpleasant, maybe not physically, but you will be hit with unkind words. You will be hit with friends who hate you after they hear you're a Christian or whatever. You're going to be opposed in some ways, and you need to be ready for that. Be willing to accept whatever it takes, because if you're going to be associated with Christ, you're going to be opposed by some people, and you need to be okay with that. So many of us are not okay with the idea that the world won't like us, but we have to get settled with that, just knowing that if we're doing what God says, some people will oppose us. Obviously, our goal is not to get everyone in the world to hate us. It's not the point. But the point is, if we're going to enter the kingdom of God, it's going to take place through a lot of tribulation. So we need to get ready for that. So thanks for reading with us. We'll see you back tomorrow for another daily Bible reading snapshot.